Hello, my name is Denise Greenberg, and I want to welcome you to this webinar entitled Top 10 Mistakes to Avoid When Renting B2B Email Lists. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief description of my background. I started Target Right Marketing in 2007 and have been in the list industry altogether for about 7 years. Prior to that, I spent over 20 years in a variety of sales and marketing roles in the high-tech industry, both in Europe and the United States, including, in the latter days, direct marketing, where I was on the client side of what I do now, which is primarily to provide lists. However, lists are not always enough to help my clients reach their goals, so I also bring in partners to solve problems. For example, if my clients need help designing and coding their HTML email, I have a partner that I bring in to help accomplish that for them. This presentation is designed to distill some of the things I've learned to help people be more successful when renting B2B email lists. So here are the top 10 mistakes. They are not leaving enough time, no test plan, renting email addresses alone as opposed to email addresses with matching phone numbers for telemarketing follow-up, having an uninspiring subject line, lack of compelling offer, weak copy and design, no extra incentive, also known as a premium, deliverability problems, landing pages that create barriers, and missing canned spam requirements. And this is the agenda that we're going to follow today. Rather than organize the presentation around mistakes, instead what I'd like to do is organize the presentation around how to do things right, and in the process, as you'll see, we'll cover the mistakes. So the first thing we're going to talk about is list order timing, then testing, why test, what to test, and how, why rent phone numbers as well as email addresses, how to optimize all campaign elements, and when to get expert help. I'm also going to focus on landing page optimization for a little while. This is an area that I see all too often neglected, and it's crucial. Finally, canned spam requirements, and I'll review some frequently asked questions with you. So the first topic is timing. Leave enough time. It's very important when you're planning an email campaign to look into list options early before you make final plans. The reason for that is that you want to make sure that lists for your target audience are readily available before you develop the rest of your campaign. So continuing about looking into list options early, let's review for a minute where do B2B lists come from, because that will reveal in some cases why your target audience may be difficult to reach through lists. Essentially, B2B email lists come from questionnaires, forms filled in by subscribers to trade publications or business and technical websites, for example, Information Week, Tech Target, Internet Retailer, B2B Magazine, etc. Also, conference and trade show attendees, and website and telephone survey respondents. So why does this matter? It matters because if the information isn't collected, it isn't available, at least not directly. Let's look at an example. This was one of my clients who's an analytics software company. They described their target prospect as senior marketers in business intelligence or analytics roles in B2B companies with 500 or more employees or $100 million or more in revenue. The challenges were, first of all, B2B. Publications don't ask if a company is B2B or B2C on those qualification cards, or at least they very rarely do. B2B Magazine is an exception, but generally that's not something you can find in a list. Publications ask about broad common job functions like marketing or sales, not business intelligence. So the solution we came up with was to omit industries that were likely to be predominantly B2C, such as retail, and to include the rare lists, and they are rare, that can do keyword searches within titles or deep title searches. For example, one list was able to provide titles that included any of a list of keywords, but omitted another. So as you can see on the slide, they could provide titles that contained any of the keywords on the include list, but that did not contain any of the words on the omit list. And it's important to note that getting this special keyword count took time. And it was also a compromise because, for example, we omitted industries that could be either B2C or B2B, such as hotels and insurance agents. So to conclude the discussion about leaving enough time, I thought I'd give you a list order timeline so that you can get a sense for all the steps involved in the process and just how much time I recommend that you leave. I'm not going to read this to you, but I will highlight the fact that I recommend you approach your list broker with a list recommendation request whenever possible 12 business days before your target email blast or transmission date. And by the way, if you didn't download the list order timeline and checklist when you registered for the webinar, I recommend you do so. It's an Excel-based tool that lets you plug in your desired transmission date and then automatically backfills for you the milestone dates you need to hit to meet that target. Now we're going to move on to a new topic, testing. Why test? What to test? And how? So first of all, it's very important to create and execute a test plan before a major rollout. Otherwise, you may spend your whole email marketing budget and not get the results you were looking for and never learn why. This isn't a new concept. From the earliest days of direct marketing, the best practice has been to establish a control and then try to beat it. I attended a Marketing Experiments webinar recently. Marketing Experiments is the company that owns Marketing Sherpa. And in that webinar, the speaker said something that really struck a chord with me. He said, the adequate is the enemy of the excellent. And when he said that, he was describing an experience he had had with one of their clients who was getting decent responses from one of their regular email campaigns and therefore never looked into whether they could improve their results. When Marketing Experiments set out to beat those results, they ended up greatly improving the results for the client. If they hadn't done this, the client would have continued to run the same old piece, never realizing that it was underperforming compared to what was possible. So testing is critical. And as you set out to define your test plan, an important rule to remember is don't try to test too many variables at the same time. So what to test? There are a lot of variables to test. And the reason for not trying to test too many variables at the same time is that if you do that, you won't know what's working and what isn't once the test is complete. So the things to test are lists, audience, subject line, body copy and design, offer, premium or incentive, landing page. And one thing about premiums, to quote Marketing Experiments again, if your premium isn't working, you don't have the right premium. So they are of the opinion that a premium or added incentive to respond is always a good idea to include in an email campaign. And this has been my experience as well. For example, I'm sure you've seen email campaigns where, as an additional incentive to respond, you've had, say, a chance to win an iPod. That's an example of a premium. An iPod may not be the right premium for your campaign, but just an example. So with all these variables to test, you can see why it's important to have a systematic plan. And the next thing is what to measure and how to measure it. This table shows you what to measure on the left and how to measure it on the right. For the subject line, body copy, design, and offer, you measure their relative success through click-through rate. For the premium and the list, there are two things to look at: click-through rate and registration rate. And for the landing page, you just look at the registration rate. By registration rate, I mean the number or percentage of people that once they click through to the landing page actually register or complete your form to receive your offer. And by now, I'm sure a number of you are wondering, what about opens? Well, here's what I think you should do about opens. Ignore them. And the reason for ignoring opens is that, guess what? Opens cannot be measured. Ideally, of course, what you'd want to do is test your subject line by measuring how many people opened the email, and then test the body copy, the design, and the offer by how many people went on after reading the email to click through to your landing page. The problem is, technically speaking, there is no way to accurately measure opens. Here's why. The way open rate tracking works is that there is an invisible graphic embedded in the HTML message that lives on a server. Whenever the message is opened, the email program goes out and pulls up all the graphics, including the opens tracker, touching the server where the opens graphic lives. These touches are counted to establish how many times, supposedly, the message was opened. There are three reasons that this doesn't actually work. First, preview panes create false opens. So if you're using Outlook, for example, with preview panes, and you scroll past the message, as you scroll past the message, Outlook goes out and opens all the graphics in the message, touching the server or servers. So that registers as an open, even though you didn't actually open the message. All you did was scroll past it. Second, many email programs today suppress images by default. If images are suppressed, the server hosting the opens tracker will not be touched when the email is read. So with the prevalence of image suppression, true opens are not counted. And finally, plain text messages are never counted because they can't contain graphics. So for all these reasons, I really urge you to ignore opens and resist attempts by others in your organization to make opens a metric by which your campaigns are measured. The only areas where I've seen that opens are useful at all is that if you see opens, at least you know your message is getting to an inbox. And maybe if you're emailing to your own list, not a rented list, and you're sending to it over and over again, and there's a sudden drastic change to the open rate, that might be an indication that there's a delivery problem. Generally speaking, however, I strongly urge you to ignore opens. This is a sample tracking report. This is my format for providing tracking reports, but any list broker that you work with should provide something fairly similar. You'll see in this case that there were 5 lists in the campaign, several different subject lines, how many messages were ordered, sent, delivered, and the number of HTML opens. Even I include them in my report because people want to see them, but I still recommend that you ignore them. The number of clicks and the click-through rate as measured against the number of messages delivered, which is the critical part of the tracking report to pay attention to. A couple of things to be aware of when you're looking at tracking reports, and they're about the clicks. First of all, make sure that clicks are measured uniformly. That is, some list owners provide the number of unique clicks, that is, unique clickers, how many unique people click through, whereas some provide the total number of clicks. If they're measuring totals and I click through twice, that will count as 2 clicks. If they're measuring uniques, that will only count as 1 click, no matter how many times I click through. And there are list owners who have the ability to provide both. Some provide uniques, some just provide totals. Unique is probably preferable, but if you're testing lists, it doesn't matter so much which you use as that you make sure that the technique is uniform, that you're seeing the same measuring technique across all the lists. And the other very important thing to make sure of is that the clicks do not include unsubscribes. Sometimes a list owner will put tracking on the unsubscribe link, and then clicks on that link will be counted as part of the total number of clicks, which is obviously not what you want to be measuring. So those are things to talk to your list broker about when you're reviewing a tracking report. So finally, why test? And this is kind of a review. I just want to emphasize this. If you don't test, you won't know which options will work best for you. And with all these variables, if you don't test, you may miss key factors that help or hinder whether you reach or exceed your goal. Remember that marketing experiments quotation, the adequate is the enemy of the excellent. Moving on to our next topic, don't just email, call too. Use a multi-channel approach. And what I mean by that is when you rent email lists, don't rent only email addresses. Also rent matching phone numbers so that you can call those people. If you do that, you're going to get a greater response rate. First of all, simply because more people will respond to multiple touches. Also, you'll achieve a much greater list penetration. In fact, you'll have an orders of magnitude increase in the number of potential customers you can engage. You have a better chance of reaching the right decision maker because if the person you call isn't the decision maker, you can find out who is. And you'll be able to add more future customers to your nurture pool. We're going to talk about all this in more detail now. So first of all, greater list penetration. Nowadays, 1% is an industry average good click-through rate when you're using a rented list. And then 40 to 60% of the clickers register or complete the form once they reach your landing page. So what does this look like? Say you rent 10,000 email addresses. 100 people click through, and 50 of them register. You've paid for the email addresses for 10,000 people and can have conversations with only 50 of them. Furthermore, only a certain number of those 50 are actually going to turn out to be prospects for you. I should also back up and explain in case any of you are new to renting lists. When you rent an email list, you don't get possession of those email addresses. Instead, the list owner transmits your message to their list. So that's why you're only able to have conversations with the people who click through to your landing page and complete your form. So again, if you rent 10,000 email addresses with matching phone numbers, you can call all 10,000 people. Of course, you're probably not really going to call all 10,000, but you're going to call a much greater number of them than would have registered on your landing page. And what's also really important is that you can call the non-responders. I've been saying you can call, but what I really mean is that you need to engage a B2B teleservices provider to make the calls. And by the way, this is one of those areas where if my clients need help, I have a partner I can bring in who does this and achieves superb results. The reasons that you want to engage a teleservices provider are as follows. First of all, you'll get greater throughput. They can make 20 to 30 calls per hour. That's a lot more calls than a typical inside sales team can make. Secondly, this way you can keep your inside sales team productive with qualified potential future customers rather than trolling through suspects. And finally, just as with email addresses, most owners will not send their phone numbers to end users. They'll only send them to a third-party call center. So if you want to make use of phone numbers, you actually have to engage a teleservices provider. case study with you. But before getting to that, there's one other thing I wanted to mention about using email addresses along with matching phone numbers. And that is the uplift from using a multi-channel approach is so significant that nowadays, whenever a client approaches me about renting B2B email lists, as long as their product or service is of a high enough value, say at least $10,000 or $15,000 as an average deal size, I strongly recommend this approach. If your product or service brings in a lot less than that, then this would be too expensive, renting phone numbers as well as email addresses and hiring a teleservices provider, that is. And if that's the case, then instead what I recommend is renting the email list from multiple email blasts. So now let's move on to the case study. This was a client who was an ERP software company, and their objective was to generate sales-ready leads for their inside sales team. They had a couple of challenges. One was a very narrow industry focus, industrial equipment and food and beverage manufacturers. And the other was that it was a complex product with a long sales cycle. Their initial plan was to rent email lists. Our advice was to add phone numbers and bring in an expert to make those calls. The email campaign went out first, and there were 19,500 emails delivered. The click-through rate was pretty good, 222 click-throughs, which is just over 1%, the industry average for a good B2B click-through rate. But look at the registrations. There were only 22 registrations, way fewer than the 40 to 60% of the click-throughs. We'll talk about that problem more when we discuss landing pages. But the result was that out of the email campaign, they had only one new opportunity. So think about that. They rented 19,500 email addresses and gained one opportunity as a result. And if they had stopped there, that's all they would have been left with. But luckily, they had taken our advice and rented matching phone numbers. And they brought in a telemarketing company to call the non-responders. With the follow-up telemarketing, what happened was that 367 prospects were contacted and graded according to how well they fit the client's criteria for a lead. They had 27 immediate opportunities, 15 future opportunities, with a total of 42 new opportunities. Big difference from the email alone. And the other thing to note was that many of these prospects weren't on the list at all. They were internal referrals from the initial contact. When the telemarketing company called and discovered that the person they were speaking to was not responsible for ERP software, they were often able to get a referral to the right person who was responsible and then go on to talk to that person. The client would never have reached those prospects at all with email alone. Here's a graphical way of looking at the results of the multi-channel boost. Again, the conversion from 1 via email alone to 42 responses via combined email and telemarketing. So the results, in other words, were 42 times better with telemarketing and email than they were with email alone. And I want to show you a couple of other examples of the kind of boost you can achieve when using matching phone numbers in combination with email and calling the non-responders rather than just using email alone. Without dwelling on the details of the specific campaigns, both of these were from a network security firm. On the left, they had a web filter offer, and with email, they got 16 respondents. When they brought in the telemarketing, they boosted the number of responses up to 233. So the response from email and telemarketing combined was 14 times greater than using email alone. And in the example on the right, they ran a campaign on the topic of internet protection for mobile users. and they went from 12 responses via email alone, that is 12 people who registered on their landing page, up to 123 via email and telemarketing combined. In that case, the results were 10 times better with a multi-channel approach. So it's really a huge difference, and I just can't urge you strongly enough. So long as the price point for your product or service is high enough, up around that $10,000 to $15,000 average deal size level, I just can't urge you strongly enough to rent phone numbers as well as email addresses. If your product or service is just too far below that price point, then as I suggested earlier, the next best thing is to rent email addresses from multiple use, multiple blasts. Your list broker should be able to negotiate discounts for you if you're ordering multiple blasts up front. Moving on to our next topic, it's important to optimize all campaign elements. You want to optimize your subject line, your offer, your incentive, the body copy and design, the deliverability, that is, how well your email gets through spam filters and displays correctly on different email programs. And you really need to pay attention to the landing pages, which I'm going to dwell on further in the presentation. And get expert help if you need it. Successful email marketing is a specialized field, and it changes all the time. There are a lot of challenges. For example, deliverability. Spam filter algorithms change constantly and are triggered not only by content, words like free or act now, but also by HTML code. There are legitimate techniques for coding HTML for websites that will trigger spam filters when used in email. And an example of how this changes all the time is the way all of us legitimate marketers have diligently placed unsubscribe links in our email to comply with canned spam regulations, right? Well, guess what? The word unsubscribe triggers spam filters. And we used to have people change the word unsubscribe to remove or remove me, but now that triggers spam filters too. And that's just one small example of how this is an area that constantly changes. Display compatibility can be tricky too. Email is much less forgiving than websites when it comes to how things are coded in HTML. What looks right in one email program may not look the way you intend in another. And design affects response. So if you aren't expert in any of these areas, I urge you to get help. DIY, that is, do it yourself, may seem the lower cost option, but the cost is actually higher when you don't get the results you need. Here's an example of how expert help can, well, help. The client in this case was a network security software company. The goal of their email campaign was to generate leads. Initially, the campaign, or the company rather, wrote, designed, and developed their own email. And they did that because do-it-yourself seemed less expensive. But after their initial results were poor, they let us bring in expert help to redesign and rewrite their campaign. Let's look at the before and after with results. This was the email they created themselves, the before example. You can see the email on the left and the results on the right. There were a lot of things that were wrong with this email. The design and copy were weak. The offer was good, but it was couched in language that wasn't compelling, just to name a couple of problems. The company name is blocked out, by the way. That's what those greenish boxes are. And look at the results. The results demonstrate that the email was ineffective. They did do at least one thing right. They tested subject lines. And you can see the results from the two different subject lines, and one did outperform the other. Subject line A, steps to protecting your online business through reliable and secure DNS, got 5 clicks, or a click-through rate of 0.15%, whereas subject line B, protecting your online business through reliable and secure DNS, received only 2 clicks, or 0.06%. So there was a difference there, but you can see that both of those are unsatisfactory results. The campaign total was only 7 clicks, amounting to a click-through rate of 0.1%. This is what the email looked like after we brought in professional help. I think you can tell just glancing at it that graphically it's more appealing. The design and copy are much more compelling. There's a headline right at the top that calls attention to a major draw, that it's a webcast featuring a Gartner analyst. This was sort of buried in the prior creative. And look at the second headline too. You may not be able to read this. So what it says is your web domain secure? The answer may surprise you. It's attention-getting. It creates curiosity. Notice too on the right that there's a premium. There was no premium in the first version. In this version, responders are offered the opportunity to receive an iPod Touch. If you look on the right at the results, you'll see that we tested 2 subject lines too, and one of them outperformed the other. So we learned something. And the next step, had the client continued with this campaign, would have been to test further and optimize further, each time striving to craft a stronger campaign with better results. Overall, what's important to note here was that there was a 700% improvement as a result of using expert help. The campaign total was 50 clicks and a click-through rate of 0.93%, nearly 1%, versus only 0.1% previously. Now I want to spend some time talking about landing page optimization. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is an area that I see neglected a lot. Yet an effective landing page is critical to a successful email campaign. Remember that ERP software company we talked about that had 222 people click through to their landing page, but once there, only 22 of them went on to register? That's why landing pages are so important. Here are some do's and don'ts for landing page optimization. Do demonstrate continuity from the email to the landing page. Don't create barriers to form completion. Ask as few questions as possible, because the more questions you ask, the more people will leave without completing your form. Don't ask questions you haven't earned the right to ask, like, what's your budget, for example. Do design so the form looks as short as possible, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But for example, if you put the first name and last name on the same line, the form will look shorter even though it's the same number of questions. Do design so that key points, the headline, the value, etc., are in the main iPath. Here's an example of what you don't want to do. See how long that is? And here's an example of what you do want to do. See how short that looks? And if first and last name were on separate lines, the form would look longer, but now it looks very short. We're going to go through a customer example of landing page optimization too. In this case, the customer was Phoenix Consulting. Phoenix Consulting was doing research for a major payments provider and needed marketers to complete a short survey on shopping cart usage on their websites. The challenge was to get enough people to take the survey to extract statistically valid data, and they had a limited budget and very limited time, and surprisingly, there are very few list options available that enable you to pinpoint companies that are actually doing e-commerce. That is, companies who are selling online from their websites. That's always been something of a surprise to me, but I've worked with a number of clients for where that's a key element of their target, so I've done the research enough times to know it's true. The plan was to do 2 successive email blasts to the same list using a gift card incentive. This was the email. The email's fine. It's a very simple request. telling the recipient that Phoenix Consulting is doing a short 3-minute survey. That's important, letting them know that the survey is short, only 3 minutes. It's for a major online payments company, and they want to hear from you. As an incentive, they're offering a $10 iCard gift redeemable from well-known brands, which they list, like Starbucks, iTunes, The Gap, to the first 150 people who complete the survey. And when the recipient selected the link to take the survey, this was the landing page they came to for the first email blast. Now, let's look at the results on the right. They had 60 clicks, which is a 1.33% click-through rate, which is pretty good. In fact, it's over the 1% average. They had 42 completes. That is, 42 people completed the survey, which worked out to a 70% to 60%. But we thought they could do better, and we advised them to make some changes to their landing page for the second email blast. Let's take a look at what the second landing page looked like. Look how much simpler this is. This email campaign was such a simple request to complete our survey that they didn't need to have all that verbiage from the email repeated on the landing page, selling them again on taking the survey. Essentially, this just brought them to little more than a logo and a button for starting the survey. And look over on the right at the results. 84% more survey completions with this approach. Sometimes all it takes is to get out of the way. The difference was that with the first landing page, 70% of the people who clicked through went on to complete the survey, whereas with the improved landing page, 87% completed the survey. That was a big difference, and it was important in order for them to have enough survey completions to have statistically valid data. Okay, finally, when you boil it down, here's how I think about landing pages, and I'm hoping this graphical representation will help you remember and think about it. You know the old expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink? You can have a great email that drives lots of traffic to your landing page. The email plus the list is leading the horse to water, and your offer is the water. So you can lead a horse to water, but if you put up too many obstacles, a poor design, or too many questions, the horse isn't going to drink, it's just going to leave. So all that effort to get people to click through is wasted if the landing page drives them away. Now our final topic, CAN spam requirements. There are 3 essential things that you have to have in your email: a means of opting out, a link to the privacy policy on your website, and your postal address. So just remember that your email copy must contain all 3 of these things, even with a rented list. Sometimes people say to me, well, isn't the list owner going to provide those things, since after all, they're the ones transmitting the message? But although they're doing the transmission, it's really your company, your message to the recipient, and so your email copy has to provide a means for the recipient to opt out from receiving further communications from you and your privacy policy and your postal address. Because they may still want to be on the list, but just not want to hear from you. We hope that's not the case, of course, but that's why those elements need to be in your email. The list owner is also going to add a header and/or a footer to your email, and they will also provide a means of opting out from the list itself. Lastly, I thought I'd put together some questions that I get asked pretty often and tell you what the answers are. The first one is, what is the minimum list order? Because all lists have minimum orders, and they vary from list to list, but 5,000 names is by far the most common. There are some lists that have higher minimums, as high as 15 to 20,000 names or email addresses, but normally it's 5,000 for a B2B email list. Phone numbers as well as email addresses. Well, why not order email addresses first and see how that goes, and then order matching phone numbers if necessary later? There's actually a big price advantage to ordering them together. That's because generally you're charged for selects only once when you do that. A select is a way of segmenting the list. Job title, industry, and company size are all examples of selects. And there's a charge for each one of them. If you order the email addresses first and then place a separate order later for the phone numbers, you have to pay for all those selects twice. But you only have to pay for them once when you rent the two together. Depending on the order, the price for the selects and the number of selects, this can be a big price difference. For example, it could be as much as $105 per 1,000. Finally, what are the price breaks for ordering multiple email blasts up front? Remember that I recommended that you do that if your average deal size isn't high enough for it to be cost effective to hire a telemarketing services provider and rent phone numbers. There is actually huge variation here depending upon the list. There are some that won't discount at all and some that are quite generous, and each case is a separate negotiation. And partly it depends upon your list broker's powers of persuasion and relationship with the list vendor. I want to thank you very much for attending my webinar. This is my contact information. Please feel free to call me or email me if you have any questions as a result of the webinar. And I'd also love to hear from you if you have any feedback as to how useful you found this webinar. Any feedback would be much appreciated. Again, thank you very much.